In today's Explorations interview, I talk with a former educator and entrepreneur who still lives in Russia. Our topic is the war Russia is waging against Ukraine. It was a rare insight into the complexities of propaganda, our notions about democracy and freedom, and our naivete here in the West, and especially the United States, about the impact we can have on the outcome of the war and what happens inside of Russia. It was also a profound mirror reflecting many of the insidious forces at play here in our own country. To understand the current war, we must understand the long reach of Russian history. We must delve into the confounding nature of propaganda that Putin and his leadership are deploying in Russia and here in the United States to create apathy and uncertainty in the face of facts and truth. Putin and political leaders here in this country know all too well that if they can tell a lie enough times, they can enforce their will over reason and rationality. There were also some invaluable lessons about what it means to create an educated, thinking electorate. Whereas we spend enormous amounts of our time educating young people about algebra, a topic that few of us will ever practically use in our lives, we do not teach children logic and how to think critically. This is true both in Russia and the United States. And perhaps the biggest failure in the early days of the fall of the Soviet Union was the assumption that Russians would embrace democratic norms and practices because they could now speak freely and their economy was converting over to a capitalistic model. Without being educated in democratic norms, how to create democratic institutions, and what it means to be an educated electorate, Russia put on the veneer of democracy, but underneath, the corrupt practices of the Soviet era persisted. The great irony is that the teaching of democratic civics has fallen by the wayside in this country. It's no wonder that people are so ready to scrap democratic principles and reject the peaceful transfer of power after an election. It would seem that Putin and Trump are working from the same playbook. Needless to say, simple stories are inadequate to explain the complexity of what is occurring in Russia today. Still, we can learn much about ourselves and the trajectory of our own country by looking closely at Russia's shortcomings and failures. One final note. To protect the identity of my guest, his name is not mentioned. As you may well know, some of his views might be seen in a negative light by the authorities in Russia. So he will remain anonymous. So welcome to Explorations. I'm pleased to have you here on the show.
Thank you.
And so we have a lot to talk about.
Okay.
And we've sort of kind of have four little chapters that I think we've identified. But I know that in the transition in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Soviet Union was beginning to break apart, and there's this huge tidal wave transition to Russia and to what looked like a new economy, a new worldview. Tell me about your point of view of that, and maybe what you were involved with at that time, and give us a little background so that people who are listening to this can understand a little of the history of how the Soviet Union became Russia that has become the Russia of today.
Well, it all began with Mikhail Gorbachev and his policy of glasnost, where a complete freedom of speech suddenly began, which never existed. And that started slowly from the year of 1985 and onwards, so that you could talk about topics that were forbidden before, and that's how it all started. People started to talk about this and that and experience all these freedoms. And then they started to experiment with some forms of business activities that didn't exist before. Not full capitalism, but a little bit like cooperative movement or something like that. So there were some ventures into this direction or that direction, because Gorbachev himself didn't have a clear idea how he wanted to proceed. He wanted to preserve socialism, but rid it of all those negative factors, that were part of the former communist system. But then the events overtook him. This glasnost overtook him, the freedom of speech, and then the people's entrepreneurial activities overtook him. And that came into conflict with the hardliners who were part of his government. And so in order to appease them, he appointed them into some important government positions. And then it all came to a crisis when they decided to remove him in August of 1991. And that's when the whole thing began, that there was an uprising in Moscow to protect those new freedoms, and the military and so forth. They wavered a little bit, but then they were on Gorbachev's side, and the coup failed, and that's when the whole thing started. So the events unraveled themselves. There was no guiding force, because Gorbachev himself wasn't a leader into the new Russia. He still wanted to preserve the old system with a new, more attractive face, so to speak. And that's how it started. And then when the coup collapsed and the new government just released people to do what they want, they lifted all the restrictions on pricing, they lifted all the restrictions on business activity and so forth. So it all started before the laws were put into effect, because it took them a few years to do that. So it was a chaotic, totally free, unbridled development in early 90s, where entrepreneurial and active people saw a lot of opportunities, and older people who were not so active, they were baffled and perplexed and in total turmoil about what was going on. And so that was the 90s. The 90s were just a period of extreme hardships for many and extreme opportunities, where a lot of things were up for grabs. And given the corruption that was inherent in the government, that's how many people became multimillionaires very quickly, by finding very creative ways of appropriating the public assets that formerly belonged to the government as a socialist or communist system, where everything belongs to everybody, and as a result doesn't belong to anybody, and is managed by the bureaucrats. So that is why when I look at some of the discourse and narrative in America about socialism, that makes me a little bit concerned. Like Bernie Sanders, whenever he speaks from the textbooks that I was reading when I was growing up, about communism and socialism and so forth, that you have to have a democratic socialism. That's impossible. It's impossible. To have a democratic socialism is impossible. That's why, to me, it's a cause of some concern. But on the other hand, you need to be aware that that these changes, they have to be accompanied by some kind of education of the people. And that's where the mistake was made. I think the major mistake of the new government of Russia and those progressive democratic leaders who were there was that they still believed in the Marxist theory, where the coin phrase was being determines consciousness. That was the most quoted phrase in the former Soviet Union as part of this Marxist-Leninist ideology, that being determines consciousness. And so their belief was that if we develop the market economy, we have the freedom of entrepreneurial activity, free market, and so forth, then the people themselves will develop the love for democracy and for the freedoms and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that didn't happen at all, because we should reverse this phrase, saying it's the consciousness that determines the being. You know, first comes the idea, and then you create your being around it. You know, and that's where the mistake was made. There were no classes of democracy, of what it means, how a democratic government functions, how the division of powers is arranged between the free press and the elected bodies like the parliament that make laws, and then the executive branch, and how they balance and counterbalance each other, and why people have to be active, going to the polls to vote, and why there should be campaigns, and the courts, the judges should be impartial. You know, it all should be taught from the very first grade and up. But somehow it was thought that it would come naturally. Once people have the freedoms of making money, starting businesses, then they will start defending their property. There should be laws, protecting private property and such. And that didn't work. So the market economy was developing quite successfully, while the understanding of how the society should be organized was never taught to the people. And that was the problem. But I could say that those new freedoms, they brought a lot of successes to Russia. For example, the standard of living, especially by the end of the 90s and early 2000s, was really improving, and all those amenities and the benefits of the free markets, all the goods and the abundance of food and goods and everything, it's part of life now. Even now, if you go out into the street and into the stores, you will see abundance of everything, because we still have this free market and free capitalism. It's still working, So on the business side, it was developing quite successfully. On the other side of the state of mind of the people, their civil stature, their position towards the government, that was not taught. People never thought that they could control the government, because originally, and it was part of the tradition which carried on, was to regard the government and the powers that are up high as some kind of weather, where you have no where you have no influence. To treat the power as weather. A storm could come, then the rain comes, then the hail comes, when that comes, people take it for granted. And so people were treating the government as the weather. Whatever they do, they take for granted, They never learned, and they were never taught that they could shape it, that they could influence it, that they could elect the leaders and make them accountable. That part was totally disregarded.
So how did when I think of people in Russia at that time and then today, how is it that they viewed the West? Because I think that they, which was where at least nominally the social structures were in place, democracy was in place. There was Did they see us as sort of a kind of a strange experiment that was kind of working out there, or not something desirable for Russia?
Well, the people who never traveled outside of the country, they still had deep inside them this communist idea of the West being unfriendly and capitalist and against Russia, against and so forth. They still had it, but it was never manifest. I mean, they would never display it. If you come to Russia, even now, being an American or whatever, you'll meet with friendly people, with friendship and a good attitude. You won't even notice it, you know. So it might be deep inside, but it's not to the extent of intensity where it would be shown in their behavior towards you, you know.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And then the younger people, they just didn't care. If I look at the younger people, they just do their own thing. But people are gullible, and if for some reason it is beneficial for the government to portray the West as the enemy, then people sort of, especially the older folks, it falls on the fertile ground, which may be hidden beneath, but it falls on it, and they start believing it. You know, people are naive, and they believe very easily, especially when the propaganda is forceful, is ubiquitous, which repeats the same thing over and over and over again from every loudspeaker, from every iron, like we say, the iron with which you iron. There's an expression here that you hear it even from the iron. If it's very forceful, then people fall prey to it. Especially the older people. The younger people, I am not so sure, because especially now, they don't watch TV, because they are in their smartphones and in their computers, and they don't watch TV. They largely, they don't care, I would say. They are totally unpolitical, and they don't care. They were not taught to be active citizens and to uphold democracy. They were not taught. They never saw it as practice in real life. And they became indifferent. They just do their own thing, and therefore, you have to regard the society not as a homogeneous whole, but there are sections of society. Some of the younger people who don't care, and who I would say, if you ask them about what's going on and why, they wouldn't answer that question. Or they may repeat something that they hear from their parents or somewhere, but I don't think they have a firm opinion. And then the older folks, for them, it reminds them of their youth, of their younger days. It brings some good memories, not because life was good back then, but because they were young and vibrant, That's why. So that's why they remember those good old days. And since the society as such has no firm conviction in the democratic values, and it's not a standard practice in the society, then if you have got an ill-meaning person who wants to influence them, then he can do it if he has this forceful propaganda, because there won't be much resistance on the part of the people, except for some. And to me, it's an interesting phenomenon that some people fall prey to the propaganda and some don't. It's the same thing as to the virus. Some people have immunity and they don't contract a virus, and some people contract it.
So, what do you think is happening there? That that some people are so susceptible to the stories that are being told through propaganda versus others immediately. You're probably you being one of those, and maybe many of the people who have left Russia in the last months.
Right.
How is it that they have developed immunity?
I still, I'm still thinking about it. I can't have a ready answer
Yeah.
because it is not confined to a certain class of people or a certain strata of society. Among those who fall prey could be professors, teachers, could be educated people, could be film directors, could be some academicians, and they're all on the side that fall prey to the propaganda. And among those who have immunity could be a simple custodian, or could be some other simple person. Or so it just it's not confined. Education and the level of awareness, and people could be well traveled. You know, some people, they live abroad and they travel abroad. They know exactly what the society abroad is like in Western countries, and they still fall prey to the propaganda. And then some who have never left Russia, a small town, I've got some people here, and they don't believe it. They have immunity. And the ultimate paradox here is, I have people in Minnesota where there's a Russian church full of Russian immigrants who have been here living for decades. And out of 50 people in that church, only 6 are against what's going on. And 46 people support it, but they live in America. They left Russia 20 years ago, you know, and they still fall to it because they watch the Russian TV in America, they watch Russian TV in Western Europe. And here is the paradox. Among the Russian immigrant community in the Western countries, the majority would be supporting this whole thing.
That is so interesting.
It's absolutely bizarre. So you can't simply explain this by saying, oh, these people are ignorant, illiterate, they've never left their small village, and that's why they don't know what Western world is like and what democracy is like, and that's why they believe it. No, you go to Berlin, you go to, I don't know, New York, and you find that Russian community, the majority of whom would be supporting, you know, the current policies of the government, you know.
Wow, that is so fascinating. And trying
Yeah, that's why you see it's extremely fascinating that there should be some other reason or some other cause which is that causes this whole thing. Some other it has to do with maybe some, you see, the basis for what's going on lies in the realm of irrationality and not rationality. That is why when people ask me, how can you explain it? Does Russia need more land, and so on and so forth? And I say, I cannot explain it. If you are staying within the realm of logic, you cannot explain it. It's unexplainable.
So you said earlier when we were preparing for the discussion that that the stories are constantly changing,
Right.
and that there's actually been a thing that's been going on here in the United States with a guy named Bannon, who you probably know of, who was an advisor to Trump, and
Yeah, I think I heard of.
he's kind of he's out there, and he made a comment or a statement, something like that. If you just inundate them with BS, and if you do enough of it, you know, there'll be so much confusion that people don't know what to believe.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
right. So the first principle, so to speak, is to instill in people the belief that Everybody tells lies. You cannot believe anybody here. You cannot believe anybody there. There are fake news here. There's fake news here. There's fake news there. You know, you have to just sow this doubt in people. As a result, their mind becomes impenetrable to facts, to truth, to logic, because they're so, everybody is like that, you know. That's the main thing. You inundate, like you say, stories, fake stories and true stories, and it's all a big mixture, and people are totally confused, you know. And in such confusion, you can dump on them whatever you want, and then you can change it all the time, you know, and they will still because what's important here is that it's like the triumph of will over rationality and over reason, to such an extent where people who are reasonable, they are weaklings, they are to be despised. You know, people who are reasonable, who think logically and so forth. You know, you sow this mistrust. And that's what's important, where might makes right. So if you have might, you have strength, and you have the will to use that strength, no matter towards what goal, then reason doesn't matter, it's defeated. That's why you can never disprove their beliefs. You can that's why some people cannot understand why can't you just talk to them, show them the facts. But doesn't work. We have a church member here who has about eight brothers and sisters over there in Ukraine, and she talks to them regularly, and they tell her what's going on, and she doesn't believe them, and as a result they have a huge quarrel within the family, you know.
Oh my
So
goodness. Yeah,
she would rather believe the TV than her own relatives, her own brothers and sisters, you know. It's very intense. What's going on, it's almost devilish. It's like satanic hypnosis, you know, over people, where you just cannot penetrate. So as a result, we stop talking to such people, and everybody says, do not try to dissuade them. It's just plain impossible. You'll just become extremely upset, and that would be it. You know. Yeah, and there are so many stories where you have like, for example, the father here is a very famous actor and film director who fully supports this whole thing, and his daughter lives in LA, and she's also an actress, I think, and so forth. And they have a family quarrel, you know. They cannot understand each other. It's a strife within the family, and it started back in 2014 very explicitly, you know, when the Crimea situation began 8 years ago. That's when this whole thing started, and now it's just exacerbated and intensified to a very huge extent. So we are dealing with some irrational way of using your own mind, you know.
Yeah, and it feels like it does feel like a fairy tale where the witch is cast a spell over the land.
It's like a spell. I think it's a spell. It's like a drug, because if people are used to watching the news on the TV, then they are so addicted to it that they need it regularly, every day. They cannot live a day without watching TV. It feeds them, it makes them feel good, it's like a drug addict, you know. You always have to have
yeah. So how is it that you have survived in all of this with some sense of of rationality.
Like I said, we stopped watching it about 15 years ago
Stop
because
watching
we knew
television.
it was contagious, it was poisonous, it's just you have to protect your psyche or state of mind. It's like that. That's why one of the famous opposition leaders here said that if you think you are sane in this situation, then you must be crazy. But if you think you are crazy now, then you are really sane. You know,
Yeah.
like if you go mad now from what's going on, then you are a sane person. But if you feel sane and happy and so forth, then you must be a crazy person who has gone mad. You know, it's the other way around. You know, and why it happened. Well, if we go to what educational institutions should be doing, we go to that topic, I think what has been missing was teaching young students logic. For example, look how many hours students spend on learning algebra. Do they need algebra in their lives? No, they don't. But no one teaches them logic. But look, logic, it's a good subject. I've got books here that are very thick with logics, which explains that you have to make one statement, then the other, then make the right conclusion, that there shouldn't be a false conclusion, that there are formulas, that there are all these problems that you have to solve. They are very similar to mathematical problems, you know, logic. Tell me, do they teach logic in American schools? No. Do they teach logic in Russian schools? No. But when I was a student, I went to a bookstore and I bought a book published before the revolution, like in 1900 or something, okay? And it was a book of logic for the schools, this thick, which explains everything thoroughly, which gives examples. Then there are exercises at the end of each class where you have to make the right conclusions, where you don't make a mistake, like all men are equal, but women are not men. That's why they're not equal, you know, so that you don't make such logical mistakes. But when people are not trained, and it has to be a lesson, it has to be a course where children have to be trained, maybe for many, many years, like they are trained in mathematics. And then they will not be gullible to the politicians and the populists and so forth, who twist this logic around, where they take a part and they present it as a whole. And that's, for example, one of the fallacies that you see on TV. That, for example, they take, for example, some small happening somewhere in the Western society, like you see a line of poor people lining for a free bowl of soup, and then they take this part and present it as a whole. Look at the Western society, everyone is poor there, there's no equality, and so on and so forth. You know, in order not to fall prey to this, you have to be trained in logic. But education, both in the West and here, has totally missed out on it. Just has never taught it. And I don't understand it.
Yeah, I don't understand it either. I've never thought about it.
Why do schools not teach it? Why universities don't teach? Why is it not an obligatory, mandatory subject? Mathematics is a mandatory subject, even though it's not as useful when it comes to algebra or trigonometry or something like that, you know. Physics may not be as useful, but they teach it. But they don't teach logic, where it's how the mind works. How, I don't know why. And I think that's the first thing that we have to do in order we want to make a real reform and make people understand what's going on, is to introduce logic from as early, I don't know, maybe 5th grade or maybe something like that, where they make very simple examples, like if you make one statement and the next, what is the conclusion? And then there are rules. I read all these textbooks. There are definite rules, like mathematical rules, that once you know those rules, you won't make a logical mistake.
Yeah, and you obviously become much more discerning
Yeah,
about what's being told to you, the stories that
yeah, and you could protect yourself from being duped, from being,
how fascinating. So this is one I've got a much deeper insight now into understanding what is going on now. Um, so where do you think all this is going? I mean, you've lived through the communist era, moving into contemporary Russia, and now we're in a, I don't know how we would characterize where Russia is today. What does the future hold for Russia?
it's a big unknown. It's a big unknown, and it could go either way. I don't think it's predetermined,
Yeah.
because it's this whole structure is on. We have this expression on clay feet. It doesn't have a solid foundation because it's all based on lies, and just stands on it. So it's not a very stable system. And I might think that very suddenly people would open up their eyes and say, hey, what's going on, you know I would say, or it could go the other way. It's a big unknown. I can't say. We want to hope that it will end very sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. But since we can have independent polls to know what the real public opinions are, then where the Western media makes mistakes is that they take the government polls and then they present it as a fact that 80% of the population support, you know, you know, which is not true. I would say that those staunch supporters maybe are 15% only. And then there would be maybe 15 or 20% on the other end. And then in the middle, you've got this inert mass of people, that either don't care, or they don't know, or they don't want to know, or maybe they kind of support it, but passively, and they will switch in a second to the other point of view,
Mm-hmm.
It's basically where the government controls the media, and they control the narrative or the story, they control it, and they can change it and twist it very quickly without any logic. They don't need to have the next part of the story logically proceeding from the first part of the story. No, it could be an opposing story, and but once they control it, then they control the way the society reacts to it. And in order to suppress opposition, they just have a big force of police and so forth, and then sometimes people think that if there is a mass protest, a huge demonstration, that they can make a difference. It can make a difference only when either the government is democratic or there is some division within the government. For example, when Maidan happened in Ukraine, the government and the parliament, they were divided. They were not monolithic, But if the government is monolithic, and they have strong military and police, like in Belarus, for example, they had huge protests, millions, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. But if the government structure is monolithic and the police are ready to defend them, the people can do nothing. It just comes to the intensity of that, how the government is willing to use force to suppress, and if they are ready to go, to all the lengths, then the people who are demonstrating cannot do anything.
How is the actions of the West right now in terms of well, they're putting all kinds of restrictions on technology and other things being imported into Russia. A lot of the American companies are leaving Russia. How is that perceived, do you think? Is it having any impact? Is it really affecting things?
Well, it may have an impact over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years. But now we almost don't feel any difference, because it's a huge economy, and then these measures, they certainly don't have any effect on the government decision making whatsoever. Moreover, they may have even an opposing effect. They dig in even harder.
Right.
It doesn't sway them. It's an opposite effect. It makes them dig in harder. In terms of the effect on the people, it's indiscriminate. It's like carpet bombing. It's, for example, what effects do we feel now? The most people who don't go abroad or don't travel or don't have any connection with foreign countries, they haven't noticed anything. They just haven't noticed anything. Who just either pensioners or work for a salary and so forth. For them, not much has changed. The stores are full. The prices haven't gone up that much. Everything seems the same so far, I say, because it's not an immediate effect. But the people, for example, who travel or who live abroad, they felt because of some financial restrictions that happened.
Right.
One of them is that Visas and MasterCards, they stopped working abroad.
Oh.
Okay? They do work in Russia. Like if I have a Visa card, and I do have them, I can still use them in Russia. Visa, MasterCards, they work in Russia fine. But I can't buy anything abroad with it, unlike before, because they stopped these operations. As a result, it hit those immigrants who left the country.
Oh, yeah, they have no access. Yeah.
Because they suddenly lost access to their money. So it hit hard the wrong people.
Right. The irony of that.
The wrong people.
Yeah.
It hit hard the wrong people, Or there were many pensioners who were living abroad. And I know one, I have a friend in Germany, who is living in Germany, but he gets the Russian pension and it's enough for him to live on. And suddenly he lost access to the money because he had this Visa card, which he could use to buy or draw money from the cash machine. Now he can't. So it made life difficult for the people who are opposing the whole thing, but not for the people who are. Or if, like, McDonald's closed, 62,000 young, vibrant people have almost lost their jobs. Did it affect the hardliners, those pensioners, those communists, those? No, they are happy. They say, oh, now we have good Russian food. We don't need that poisonous American food, So the people who are supposed to be suffering are joyful. So these sanctions, they are so indiscriminate. And in most cases, they hit the wrong people, For example, they want to weaken the economy. But the first victims would be the small and medium-sized businesses, because those government-supported businesses, they will get subsidies from the government and they won't have such a strong effect. But small mom-and-pop stores and so forth, that's where, you know, the big effect will be felt. And of course, these people are, for the most part, against this whole thing, you know. So I think those sanctions, they're not smart sanctions. They are indiscriminate sanctions that, for the most part, have the opposite effect. You know, it's they should be probably more. They should be targeting the culprits. That's what I think, but not the rank and file. I mean, who have no. And then what's even more important is that the effect will be felt over the years, you know. It won't be felt immediately. And it's not felt immediately because it's been, what, 3 months, and the price of gas has stayed the same. The food has stayed about the same. There were some price rises in certain electronics, important foods. Then automobiles, yes, the new automobiles, they increased in price, but the used automobiles maybe a little bit increased in price. So there's no immediate effect right now, except, and here I must say where the exception is, except if you have lost your job, you know, then you'll feel an effect immediately. But for that, again, it needs time. It can't happen immediately, even though in some sectors, yes, you could see it. But I don't see it around here. But maybe because I'm in a small town. Here, all companies are working and stores are working and so forth. You don't feel much difference. Maybe in bigger cities, in industrial cities where they depend on one or two singular plants, maybe then you can feel the effect, but not immediately. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, I think there was this irrational belief that this would put pressure on the economy and the Russian people would rise up and
No,
yeah and
no,
protest.
no, because if people start feeling it, hardships, then the government will point to the enemy who caused this hardships. You know, it'll be a very good, useful tool for their propaganda. Hey, you lost your job, you're living poor now. Well, because of this sanctions, and we have long told you that they are the enemy and they are strangling you, you know. So it's a useful tool for the propaganda. Because if you look at Cuba and North Korea and Iran and so forth, it only hardens the regime, makes the regime stronger. It doesn't weaken the regime, because then poor, hungry people, they have no choice but go closer to the regime, to wait for handouts, to wait for support from the regime. You know what I mean? It draws them closer to it. It doesn't alienate them from it. So I don't know what the right strategy should be.
Yeah. Well,
so the world is strange.
The world is strange. What I have gotten from today is that there's such a paradox to all of this, and what we feel is up really is down, and vice versa.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
that's right.
And it and making a shift and change in it is it seems in some ways you talked about insanity
It's
and
pretty much insanity. Yeah, it is. It's unbelievable. And then of course, if you look at the role of the West here, about several former prime ministers of Europe were on the board of all these big Russian corporations.
Mhm.
Who was strengthening the regime, I wonder, you know?
Yeah,
Look,
yeah, former
look, the Prime
KGB,
Minister
yeah,
of France, the
yeah,
Prime Minister of Germany, the
Germany.
Prime Minister of Austria, the Prime Minister of Finland. If you Google it, you will see about a dozen of them, you know, serving on the boards of those government oil and gas and other corporations, getting huge money from it and so forth. So it lies in some, I don't know, in some irrational side of the human mind, I think. Very, very strange. And then the other strange thing, which is even stranger than what I have been describing, is that if you look at the church, well, the Russian Orthodox Church fully supports. It's just no doubt about it. Okay, and the priests and so forth, they told the party line in every their sermon. But in Protestant churches, look at the Pentecostal Union here. Look at the head of the Pentecostal Union here, who sits on the government bodies and who fully supports the whole thing, you know. So even the Christians, even the evangelical Christians, well, you could say Orthodox Christians, they're conservative. But look at the evangelical Christians, what's going on among them, among their midst. And look at Franklin Graham, for example, who visited Putin 2 or 3 years ago. And then when he returned, he called him the defender of Christian faith. Because of this anti-gay law that Putin passed.
Right.
You know, it's not only the, like I said, the ignorant, illiterate people who are duped, you know.
Yeah,
The world elite is the Christians. It goes much deeper than just a simple explanation, you know.
well, that is what I've gotten from today is that it is not a simple explanation. It's a complex story.
Right, right.
And I want to thank you for sharing. I think once I've had this edited down, I think people um, it will give them an insight into what is a very, very complex issue that doesn't have a simple story. And so thank you.